Chapter 1. The Train in the Dark. In war, the most dangerous things are often the ones nobody expects. A submarine was never supposed to hunt a train. It was built to sink ships, to vanish under the waves, to strike where the enemy least expected it. But in the summer of 1945, deep in the Pacific, Commander Eugene Fluckey was about to turn that logic upside down. Far from the open ocean, along a dark and silent stretch of Japanese coastline, a train was moving through the night. It carried men, ammunition, and supplies for a war that was already slipping out of Japan's hands. And somewhere offshore, almost invisible against the black water, USS Barb was waiting. This was no ordinary patrol. By then, Barb had already earned a fearsome reputation. She was one of the most successful submarines in the American fleet, a boat that had survived brutal hunts, aggressive depth charge attacks, shallow water risks, and some of the most daring submarine operations of the war. Her commander, Eugene "Lucky" Fluckey, was known for something rare in wartime. He did not think like everyone else. He did not accept limits simply because they had always existed. If a target could not be reached in the usual way, he would find another way. If the Navy had never done something before, that was never a reason for him to stop. That way of thinking had already made him famous. But fame was not the point. What mattered to Fluckey was effect. And in the final months of the Pacific War, the effect he wanted was not just to sink another ship. He wanted to create a shock so unexpected, so bold, that it would be remembered long after the war ended. A train on a Japanese home island was not just a train. It was a supply line, a military artery, a piece of the enemy's confidence. If he could destroy it, he would prove that nowhere was safe. The idea sounds almost impossible at first. A submarine cannot simply fire torpedoes at a moving train. Deck guns are too crude for precision land attacks. Rockets can hit shore targets, but not a train racing through the dark. So Fluckey and his crew had to solve a problem that no manual had prepared them for. They needed to turn the railroad itself into a weapon against the train. That was where the crew of Barb came in. The men aboard her were not merely sailors. They were survivors, mechanics, improvisers, and quiet specialists in making impossible things work. They knew how to fix broken machinery in cramped compartments, how to repair damage under pressure, how to think fast when the enemy was closing in. And when Fluckey explained what he wanted, they did not laugh. They started designing. What they built was simple, ruthless, and ingenious. A hidden explosive charge would be buried beneath the rail. A switch would be rigged so the weight of the locomotive would trigger the circuit. The train would destroy itself. There was no dramatic technology in it, no elaborate device, no Hollywood flourish. Just a hard, practical solution built from submarine parts, batteries, and a scuttling charge. It was the kind of idea only war could produce. Crude in appearance, brilliant in effect. But the device was only half the mission. The other half was getting men onto Japanese soil to plant it. That was the real gamble. 8 sailors would have to leave the submarine, cross to shore in inflatable rafts, move through enemy territory, dig beneath the tracks, and return before dawn. If they were discovered, they would be trapped on Japanese home ground with no cover and no rescue. If the submarine was spotted too early, she might be forced to dive before the men returned. If the weather changed, the moon came out, or a patrol passed at the wrong moment, the entire operation could collapse in seconds. Still, the men volunteered. Every single one of them. That says something important about Barb's crew. This was not a group pushed into danger by orders alone. They trusted Fluckey, and Fluckey trusted them. He selected carefully, choosing men who were strong, calm, disciplined, and practical. He needed skill, yes, but he also needed nerve. The kind of nerve that does not show off, does not brag, and does not freeze when the night suddenly turns hostile. Then they waited for the right conditions. And in war, waiting can be its own kind of combat. The sea had to be calm enough for the rafts. The moon had to stay hidden. The clouds had to cooperate. The approach had to remain quiet. Everything depended on timing, and every passing hour made the mission feel heavier. The train might be there, it might not. The Japanese might change schedules. The submarine might have to move before the shore party returned. There were too many variables, and Fluckey knew it. But he also knew something else. War is full of routine. Enemies grow comfortable. They think distance protects them. They think the sea is enough of a barrier. Fluckey was about to exploit that assumption. He wanted the Japanese to believe they were safe behind shoreline, hills, and rail lines. Then, he intended to prove that safety was an illusion. At last, the weather gave him what he needed. Cloud cover thickened overhead. The moon faded. The coast disappeared into darkness. The sea became a black surface without features, perfect for a submarine that wanted to remain unseen. Barb moved toward shore with the caution of a predator. She did not rush. She did not need to. In a mission like this, silence was speed. On deck, the 8-man shore party prepared to leave. They checked their tools. They checked the explosive. They checked their batteries. They checked the rafts. They checked each other. That last part mattered more than anything else. Before a mission like this, the real question was not whether the equipment would work. It was whether the men would. Then, the rafts slipped into the water. No cheers, no speeches. No heroic soundtrack. Just the sound of rubber touching the sea and paddles breaking the surface in the dark. The crossing was short in distance, but enormous in meaning. Each stroke carried them further from safety and closer to history. Ahead of them lay a shore, occupied by the enemy. Behind them sat the submarine that had brought them here. Between those 2 points was the entire weight of the mission. The beach came first. They reached it without alarm. The rafts were dragged above the tide line, hidden as best they could be, and the men moved inland. The darkness was thick enough to swallow shapes, but not thick enough to erase danger. Grass, uneven ground, drainage ditches, a road, a rail embankment. Each obstacle had to be crossed carefully, because one stumble could make noise, and noise could bring Japanese patrols running. Then, they found the tracks. A railway line at night has a strange kind of power. In daylight, it looks ordinary, almost dull. In darkness, it becomes a line of possibility and threat. The men crouched near the embankment and listened. Somewhere out there, a train was moving through the blackness, and when it arrived, everything depended on whether they had chosen the right place. They had. The first train appeared without warning, a heavy freight engine pulling cars through the dark with no visible light. It thundered past the hidden Americans so close they could feel the vibration in the ground. Steam hissed. Wheels clattered. The men stayed motionless until the sound faded into the night. That moment confirmed what they needed to know. The line was active. The line was vulnerable. And the line was about to become a battlefield. Now came the hardest part. The crew began digging. Not frantically, but fast enough to beat the clock. Gravel gave way. Dirt loosened. The hole deepened beneath the rail, hidden from view by the darkness and the patience of the men working inside it. Every scrape of metal against stone felt too loud. Every pause felt too long. They knew that in a few minutes, maybe less, another train could come. They also knew that once the explosive was in place, they would have to leave immediately. At the bottom of the hole, the charge was set. The batteries were placed beside it. The switch was aligned with care. Nothing in the device was glamorous. It was a soldier's solution, not an engineer's fantasy. It was built for one purpose only: to make a locomotive destroy itself in the dark. And then, just as the work was nearly done, the crew heard it again. Another train. This one was coming from the opposite direction. The men dropped flat beside the track, hidden by the darkness and the embankment, waiting as the locomotive rolled past in complete blackout conditions. The train rumbled by, freight cars shaking over the rails, and the Americans lay still while history passed over their heads. Then, silence returned. When the sound disappeared, the shore party moved with fresh urgency. They finished the installation, covered the device, smoothed the gravel, and made the rail look untouched. From the surface, nothing would give it away. The explosive was invisible. The trap was armed. Now, they had to get back. The return march was faster, but no less dangerous. The beach, the rafts, and the submarine all waited in darkness. Far offshore, Barb was still there, holding position, ready to pull away the moment the men returned. The commander had only one question left to answer. Would they make it in time? They were paddling back when the tension finally snapped. From the submarine, Fluckey saw or sensed what the shore party already knew. The train was coming again, and this time, the timing was dangerously close. He called for them to hurry. The paddles worked harder. The rafts cut through the water. Every second felt stretched thin. And then the men climbed back aboard Barb. One by one, they scrambled up the hull and through the hatches, the last men aboard, just as the submarine prepared to move. The rafts were abandoned. There was no time to recover them. There was only the mission and the sea and the feeling that a giant invisible hand had just pulled a trigger in the dark. Because the train was now almost there. Offshore, Barb began to withdraw toward deeper water. Her deck was crowded with men who knew they had just done something no submarine crew had ever done before. They had crossed onto enemy soil, planted an explosive beneath a railway, and escaped. But the story was not over yet. The real moment was still coming. Beneath the Japanese rail line, hidden under dirt and gravel, the charge waited in silence. A few miles offshore, a submarine pulled away into the dark. And somewhere between those 2 points, a train was rushing toward its own destruction. That was the trap, and it was about to spring. Chapter 2. The trap springs. The train came exactly when the men needed it to. In the darkness along the Japanese coast, the locomotive rolled forward with the confidence of a machine that had no idea it was already doomed. Its engine chugged steadily, its freight cars rattled behind it, and its crew had no reason to suspect that, beneath the rails ahead, 8 American sailors had turned the track into a weapon. The night was calm. The sea was black. The coastline gave nothing away. Then, the locomotive reached the trap. At first, nothing seemed to happen. The engine kept moving, steel wheels pressing against the rail, the weight of the train forcing every part of the line to bear down under pressure. And then, deep beneath the surface, the hidden switch closed. The circuit completed. The charge detonated. The explosion tore upward from under the locomotive with violent force, shattering the engine in an instant. Steam burst into the air. Metal split apart. Fire flared across the track. The train, which had been racing confidently through the night only moments before, was suddenly transformed into wreckage. The impact was immediate and catastrophic. The locomotive was thrown into chaos, its boiler rupturing under the force of the blast. The front of the train disintegrated. The first cars slammed into the remains behind the engine, buckling and twisting as the momentum of the freight line carried them into the wreckage. Cars stacked, derailed, and collapsed in a wave of destruction. What had been a moving military supply train became a pile of burning steel and shattered freight in seconds. From offshore, the crew of Barb could see the explosion. They had not only succeeded, they had done something the enemy would remember. But victory in war rarely arrives in a single clean moment. An explosion is only the beginning. The question that follows is always the same. What happens next? Fluckey knew that the Japanese would respond quickly. Searchlights would sweep the shore. Troops would move into position. Coastal units would begin hunting for the source of the blast. The submarine still had men on the surface. The rafts were gone. The shoreline was already becoming dangerous. And now, the enemy knew that something had struck them from the sea. The crew turned their attention from the explosion to escape. This was the part of the mission that mattered most in practice, even if history tends to focus on the dramatic detonation itself. The Americans had to get away before the Japanese could react. That meant Barb needed to pull into deeper water, fast enough to avoid being trapped in the coastal shallows. It also meant the shore party had to return without hesitation, because every extra second on Japanese soil increased the risk of discovery, capture, or death. The men had done their job. Now they had to survive it. As the submarine moved away from shore, Japanese searchlights began to appear. First one beam, then another, then several, sweeping across the water with a methodical urgency that made the scene feel even more dangerous. The shoreline was no longer quiet. It was awake. The enemy knew that someone had struck a critical target, and now they were looking for the attacker. That is what made the operation so remarkable. The explosion itself was bold, but the escape required discipline. A reckless crew could make noise, panic, or lose formation. Fluckey's men did none of that. They understood that the mission was not complete until they were back aboard and the submarine had cleared the kill zone. So they moved with the same calm precision they had shown on shore. The rafts had already been abandoned, so there was no delay, no recovery effort, no extra weight to slow them down. They had crossed the line into enemy territory and back again. What remained now was distance. The submarine needed depth. The men needed air. And the Japanese needed time they would not be given. Fluckey made the judgment call that separated a good commander from a careless one. He did not wait too long. He did not panic too early. He timed the submarine's withdrawal to the limits of shallow water, balancing the need to protect the men still exposed on the surface against the need to avoid being trapped by enemy response. It was a dangerous compromise, but it was the only one available. In war, ideal choices are rare. Good commanders live in the space between bad options and better ones. The boat pulled farther offshore. By then, the shore party was already back aboard. They had crossed the beach, reached the rafts, paddled through the darkness, and climbed into the submarine with the kind of exhausted focus that comes only after a mission has gone exactly right and still feels like it could unravel at any second. Their work was finished. Their bodies were there. Their minds, for a moment, were still on the beach. But the explosion was already changing the night. Japanese personnel along the coast were scrambling. The blast had not just destroyed equipment, it had struck confidence. A train running in blackout conditions on a guarded coastal line had been annihilated by an unseen attacker. The enemy could not ignore that. It was too brazen, too unusual, too humiliating. Somewhere in the darkness, the Japanese chain of command was already trying to understand how it had happened, and they would never have a satisfying answer. That uncertainty was part of the power of the attack. The Japanese could see the destruction, but not the submarine. They could measure the damage, but not fully understand the method. They knew only that an American crew had crossed onto their soil, planted an explosive beneath a rail line, and escaped under their noses. That kind of strike creates more than wreckage. It creates doubt. A few miles offshore, Barb continued to move. The submarine no longer needed to remain close to the coast. Her mission had shifted from attack to survival. The deeper water she reached, the safer everyone aboard would become. Yet the men could still see the glow behind them, a distant sign of the fire and chaos they had left in their wake. The scene carried a strange emotional weight. This was not a battle of armies meeting face to face. There were no flags waving, no formal front lines, no heroic charges in daylight. It was something smaller in scale and larger in consequence. A handful of sailors, a rail line, a train, and a sudden burst of violence in the dark. That contrast is what makes the story so powerful. It feels improbable because it was. And yet, it happened. Once the submarine reached safer water, the tension began to shift. The immediate danger was not over, but it had changed shape. The crew could breathe a little more easily, though not much. Japanese patrols might still search the area. The aircraft could appear later. Coastal batteries might be alerted. The next several hours would require caution, patience, and discipline. Barb could not afford to become careless, simply because the raid had succeeded. That was Fluckey's advantage as a commander. He understood that boldness was only useful when paired with control. Anyone can take a risk. The hard part is taking the risk and still managing the aftermath. As the hours passed, the submarine stayed alert. The men who had been ashore were now back in their familiar environment, but they were not relaxed. They had just crossed from one world into another and back again. The experience leaves a mark, not always visible, not always spoken, but real. For them, the mission was more than a tactical success. It proved that the enemy's home waters were not untouchable. It proved that submarines could do more than sink ships. It proved that a commander willing to think creatively could turn an impossible problem into a historical first. And it proved something else too, that the men aboard Barb were not just following orders. They were part of a crew capable of inventing a new kind of warfare on the spot. That is the part of the story that often gets lost in the retelling. The train explosion was the climax, but the real story was the chain of decisions that made it possible. The willingness to experiment, the confidence to send men ashore, the discipline to dig, wire, and leave without panic, the coolness to return under pressure, the professionalism to survive the retaliation that followed. When people hear about the mission, they usually remember the audacity of sinking a train. But what made it truly extraordinary was the combination of imagination and restraint. It was daring without being reckless, violent without being chaotic, brilliant because it was so precisely executed. By the time the submarine was clear of the coast, the Japanese had lost more than a train. They had lost the illusion that their shoreline was secure, and that was exactly what Fluckey wanted. The coast disappeared behind Barb, the smoke faded in the distance, and the night settled again over the Pacific. But the mission was now beyond the control of any one man. It belonged to history. The train had been destroyed. The shore party had returned. The submarine had escaped. What remained was the echo. Inside the Japanese command structure, the attack would force questions, fear, and adjustments. Defenses would be tightened. Patrols would be expanded. Resources would be shifted to protect rail lines and coastal approaches. One exploding train had accomplished what many conventional attacks struggle to do. It forced the enemy to spend time, manpower, and attention on a threat they had not expected. And that is the deepest truth of the operation. A great raid does not only destroy what it hits, it changes what the enemy must think about next. The men of Barb had done that in a single night. They had crossed the boundary between sea and shore, turned a railroad into a trap, and vanished before the reaction could catch them. No grand army, no invasion force. Just a submarine crew, willing to do something no one had done before. And as the dark Pacific carried Barb away from the coast, the explosion behind them still burned in the memory of everyone aboard. That was the moment the story became legend. Chapter 3. The Price of Survival. The explosion on the coastline was not the end of the mission. In many ways, it was merely the opening of a new, more dangerous phase. While the wreckage of the train still smoldered on the tracks, the USS Barb was navigating the most perilous stretch of her entire war. The submarine was essentially a high-value target now marked by fire and light, operating in waters where the Japanese military would be swarming with a sense of frantic, vengeful urgency. Commander Eugene Fluckey knew the geography of the situation better than anyone. He understood that the immediate aftermath of a successful sabotage mission is when a crew is most vulnerable to the law of retaliation. The Japanese did not just lose a train, they lost their sense of security. And a military that loses its security becomes a military that lashes out with everything at its disposal. For the next few hours, Barb had to become a ghost. The submarine's engine room, usually a place of controlled rhythm, became a zone of absolute silence. Every unnecessary piece of machinery was shut down. The air inside the boat grew thick and stale, as the ventilation systems were restricted to prevent any vibration from traveling through the hull. Men stood at their stations, listening to the muffled, terrifying ping of enemy sonar that they knew would soon be scouring the seabed. The crew of Barb had just performed a miracle of audacity, but now they were trapped in the crushing reality of submarine warfare. Down here, you don't fight with rockets or shovels. You fight with silence. You fight by holding your breath while a destroyer's propellers thrash the water above you, turning the ocean into a chaotic soup of sound. Fluckey sat at the periscope, his eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the dawn. The sky began to pale, revealing the terrifying reality of their position. The coastline of Karafuto, once a dark shadow where they could hide, now became a wall of danger. Japanese search planes had already arrived. The drone of aircraft engines echoed across the surface, a sound that sends a distinct cold shiver down the spine of every submariner. These were not random patrols. These were search and destroy sorties specifically tasked with finding the ghost that had blown up their supply train. This was the price of survival. You don't get to execute a legendary operation without paying the bill in nerves and endurance. Inside the hull, the men who had been on the shore party were now trying to transition from the adrenaline-fueled high of the Sabotage back to the grinding, tedious tension of a war patrol. It is a psychological transition that is hard to describe. 1 hour, you are literally holding a detonator on enemy soil. The next, you are sitting in a cramped, dark tube, praying that a depth charge doesn't find the pressure hull. The discipline required to maintain that state of calm is what separates a world-class crew from the rest. Fluckey watched his men. He saw the sweat on their brows, the way they gripped the handrails, the way they spoke in whispers. He didn't offer grand speeches. He offered them the one thing a crew needs in the face of death: confidence. He kept the boat moving, he kept his head, and he kept their eyes focused on the mission that remained. Because the mission wasn't over. Even with the heat of the search parties bearing down on them, Fluckey refused to retreat to safety. He knew that the Japanese response was a distraction. While their planes and boats were focused on the site of the train explosion, other targets along the coast remained vulnerable. It was a classic lucky Fluckey maneuver. The moment the enemy assumes you have retreated, you strike again. It was a risky calculation. Many commanders would have cleared the area, signaled success, and headed for open water. But Fluckey wasn't playing for safety. He was playing to win. He looked at his chart, identified a coastal radio station and a small shipyard, and made a decision that must have made his executive officer's heart skip a beat. They were going to stay and fight. The atmosphere in the control room shifted from defensive to offensive. The tension didn't vanish, it sharpened. As the sun rose higher, the Barb began to stalk the coastline again. It felt almost defiant. They were hunting in the very shadow of the forces that were hunting them. They used the submarine's periscope as a weapon, gathering intelligence on coastal defenses, spotting patrol boat patterns, and mapping out the next targets. Then came the moment of action. The submarine surfaced, not in the cover of night, but in the encroaching twilight. The order was given to man the deck gun. The men who had been digging in the dirt only hours before were now standing on deck, the salt spray hitting their faces, preparing to shell a military radio installation. The firing sequence was quick. Boom! 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 The 4-inch deck gun barked, sending shells screaming toward the shoreline. They hit the radio antenna with surgical precision, turning the structure into a twisted mess of burning steel. The radio station, which had been sending out alerts about their presence, went dead. For the crew, it was a moment of release. The silence of the previous hours was replaced by the roar of the gun and the satisfying thud of impacts. It was proof that they were still in control. They were not victims to be hunted. They were the predators of the Pacific. But the danger was far from over. Almost immediately, the Japanese response materialized. Small coastal patrol boats, alerted by the gunfire, began racing toward the coordinates. Fluckey stood on the bridge, watching them through his binoculars. He didn't rush. He waited until the last possible moment, letting the patrol boats get close enough to think they had him, before ordering the emergency dive. The boat slipped under the water with the grace of a dolphin. The ocean closed over them, and for a few seconds, there was only the sound of water rushing past the hull. Then came the rattle, the distant, thunderous percussion of depth charges. They were close. The Barb groaned under the pressure of the explosions. Lights flickered. The boat lurched as if it had been struck by a giant hand. Men grabbed anything solid to keep their footing, but nobody panicked. They knew the depth, they knew the submarine's limits, and they knew Fluckey would guide them through the darkness. This was the true test of their training. When the world is exploding around you, can you hold the boat steady? Can you keep your hands from shaking while you adjust the valves? The crew of the Barb answered that question with a resounding yes. They operated the submarine with the mechanical precision of a clock. They moved in perfect unison, a living organism of steel and intent. As the depth charges faded, replaced by the ominous silence of the sonar search, the crew finally allowed themselves a moment of reflection. They had done the impossible. They had blown up a train, escaped a massive hunt, destroyed a radio station, and lived to tell the tale. But as they settled in for the long, agonizing trek toward Midway, the mood in the submarine was not one of celebration. It was one of profound, quiet exhaustion. They were men who had pushed past the edge of the map and had seen what lived there. They were tired. They were covered in grease, sweat, and salt. They were hungry. Yet, in that shared, cramped space, there was an invisible bond that had been forged in the fire of those 24 hours. They knew that when they got back to base, they wouldn't just be returning as sailors. They would be returning as something entirely new. They looked at one another, the guys from the shore party, the engineers who kept the boat running, the gunners who had fired the deck cannon, and they recognized the same look in each other's eyes. It was the look of men who had done the work, who had held the line, and who knew that, despite all the odds, they were going to make it home. The Barb began her slow, steady climb toward the surface, leaving the enemy's coastal hunt far behind. They had paid the price of survival in full, and they had come out the other side changed. The mission was now etched into the steel of the submarine, and more importantly, into the hearts of the men who manned her. They were headed back to the war, but they carried with them the memory of that burning train and the knowledge that, against all odds, they had changed the rules of the game. If you're ready, I'm prepared to dive into Chapter 4, the final act, where the legend is solidified and the crew finally returns home. Chapter 4, the legend of the locomotive. The journey back to Midway Island was not a victory parade. For the crew of the USS Barb, it was a slow, meditative transition from the chaos of combat back to the structured life of the Navy. As the submarine cut through the vast, empty reaches of the Pacific, the adrenaline of the Karafuto mission began to ebb, replaced by a strange, quiet realization. They had done something that simply shouldn't be possible. When Barb finally slid into the harbor at Midway, the scene was calm. But as the submarine made her approach, the men on deck couldn't help but notice the way the base seemed to lean in. Word had traveled ahead. The audacity of the mission, the reports of a sunken train on Japanese home soil, and the rocket bombardments had reached the ears of the brass. But for the men standing on the deck, the awards, the medals, and the admirals waiting on the pier were secondary. What mattered was the number that Commander Fluckey cherished more than any Medal of Honor or Navy Cross: 0. 0 casualties. 0 Purple Hearts. 0 men left behind. They had taken a boat into the shallowest, deadliest waters of the Japanese Empire, faced searchlights, patrol boats, and coastal artillery, and they had brought every single soul home. That was the real achievement. In the brutal accounting of war, where ships are lost and crews are decimated, Barb had achieved the impossible. She had made war on the enemy's own terms and survived it unscathed. As they tied up at the dock, Admiral Chester Nimitz himself was there to greet them. Seeing the Admiral standing on the pier was a reminder of the scale of what they had done. Nimitz, the man overseeing the entire Pacific War, wanted to see the crew that had turned a submarine into a commando unit. The moment the battle flag was unfurled, the crowd fell silent. It was a flag that told a story. It had the standard battle stars and unit citations, but at the bottom, there was a new, hand-painted symbol, a Japanese locomotive. It was the only submarine flag in history to carry such a patch. It looked almost cartoonish in its simplicity, but to anyone who knew the story, it was a badge of pure, focused ferocity. It represented the moment the rules of naval warfare were rewritten. But the story of the Barb didn't end on that pier. The world was changing fast. While the crew was still celebrating their return, history was accelerating. 6 days after they arrived at Midway, the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 9 days later, Japan surrendered. The war that had defined the Barb and her crew for 3 years vanished in a flash of light. The men who had gone ashore on Karafuto found themselves suddenly thrust into a world they didn't quite recognize. They had spent years preparing for a life-or-death struggle, and now that struggle was over. They went back to civilian life, to factories, to railroads, to families they hadn't seen in years. Billy Hatfield went back to the railroad, the very thing he had spent his nights trying to destroy. Paul Saunders returned to a quiet life. They rarely talked about Karafuto. Why would they? Who would believe that they had paddled ashore with a pickle jar full of explosives to blow up a train? Yet, the legacy of the mission grew. In the decades that followed, the Karafuto raid became a case study at the U.S. Naval Academy. It wasn't just taught because it was cool. It was taught because it was a proof of concept. Fluckey's decision to bolt rocket launchers onto the deck and send a shore party to sabotage infrastructure was a precursor to the modern age of special operations. He had proven that a submarine is not just a torpedo platform. It is a multi-dimensional weapon of war. The Barb herself didn't fare as well as her crew. After the war, she was relegated to training, then modernization, and finally, she was sold to the Italian Navy, renamed, and eventually scrapped. When Fluckey heard that the submarine he had commanded through the most daring raids in history was being cut apart for scrap metal in an Italian yard, he was reportedly devastated. He said that if the crew had known, they would have scraped together every penny they had to buy her back and turn her into a museum. But they were too late. The Barb was gone. However, the battle flag survived. Today, if you visit the Submarine Force Library and Museum in Groton, Connecticut, you can see it behind glass. It is faded now, the colors a bit muted by time, but the locomotive at the bottom is still there. It serves as a reminder that the most significant impacts in history are often made by the people who don't wait for permission. Eugene Fluckey went on to become a Rear Admiral, a man who saw the transition from the diesel-powered submarines of World War II to the nuclear-powered titans of the Cold War. He retired in 1972, but he didn't stop working. He moved to Portugal, opened an orphanage, and spent his remaining years caring for children who had lost everything to the conflicts of the 20th century. He died in 2007 at the age of 93. When you look back at the story of the Barb, it's easy to get lost in the tactics, the pickle jar batteries, the micro switches, the rocket salvos. But the real story is about the man at the helm and the men in the crew. Fluckey was a commander who demanded total perfection, but gave his men the ultimate gift. A commander who valued their lives more than his own glory. He didn't just win battles, he maintained a culture of excellence that defied the chaos of war. He believed in his crew, and they in turn believed that as long as they were on the Barb, they were invincible. And for 5 patrols, against the entire might of the Japanese military, they were. The mission on Karafuto remains the only Allied ground combat operation on Japanese home soil during the Pacific War. No Marines, no paratroopers, no heavy artillery, just 8 sailors with shovels and an idea. It stands as a testament to the power of human ingenuity under pressure. It reminds us that when you're at the end of your rope, when the standard solutions fail, you don't give up. You invent a new way forward. In the quiet of the museum, the flag tells its own story. Visitors look at the 17 ship symbols, and then their eyes drift down to the little black train at the bottom. It's the patch that doesn't belong, the one that breaks the pattern. And in that patch, you see the entire spirit of the war in the Pacific. A war that was fought in the deep, blue silence of the sea, but won by the people who were brave enough to reach out and change the world. The Barb is gone, the war's a memory, and the men are mostly gone now too. But the lesson remains. They showed us that a small group of people, acting with courage and purpose, can shape the outcome of a global conflict. They showed us that the limits of what is possible are set only by our own fear, and that when you push past those limits, you find not just victory, but a legacy that will last as long as the sea itself. History is usually written by the people who have the biggest guns and the largest armies. But sometimes, history is written by a handful of sailors who dared to paddle a rubber raft toward an enemy beach in the middle of the night. That is the story of the Barb. That is the story of the train. And that is why, nearly a century later, we are still telling it. If you have enjoyed this journey through the history of the USS Barb, consider subscribing and hitting the like button. There are countless other forgotten tales from the depths of World War II, and we are committed to telling them all. Thank you for listening.